I love the works of Eric LaRocca. I love horror, and he has quickly become my favorite horror writer. But how? What happened? How does one become your favorite writer of a particular genre? Well, I started with this, and I think probably a lot of people did, because this book really exploded. Not literally, but we will come to explosions. Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke is a short story slash maybe novella written by Eric LaRocca that went hugely viral, people loved it, and that included me. It's an epistolary short story about two women who enter into a long-distance, abusive, pseudo-romantic relationship. One woman promises to pay off the other woman's debts and pay her rent and support her financially if the other woman, who is obviously very vulnerable and in desperate need of support, does everything the first woman tells her to do. They communicate via instant messages and emails, and their relationship becomes incredibly dark and dangerous as it goes. This is a story about abuse, about imbalances within relationships, about how certain people can take advantage of others, about positions of power and authority. And because it's written in this epistolary manner, you feel like a voyeur. You are spying on their private messages. You feel like you're in a cage with these two people. And the thing is that what's happening here in this cage is dangerous and frightening, unsettling, unhinged, and there's nothing you can do about it. You sit there with your eyes pinned open, you read and you watch, and you are terrified, and it is so good. I read it in a single sitting, and I loved every second. I am not sure if I took a breath. I must have, but I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't. This book also includes two other stories that are both equally excellent, much shorter, equally strange, equally brave, and that's kind of what I want to talk about, is the bravery and the boldness of Eric LaRocca. Since reading Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, I've read his short story collection, The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, the novella You've Lost a Lot of Blood, another novella, We Can Never Leave This Place, and his, at the time of recording, new full-length horror novel, Everything the Darkness Eats, which Eric actually personally sent me. Like, he emailed me. I can't quite believe this. I was completely starstruck when I got an email from Eric LaRocca himself. But when I talk about the boldness and the bravery of Eric LaRocca, I'm talking about the inherent risks that come with writing horror. Horror is a genre that needs to do a lot in order to live up to its name. And again, horror is my favorite genre, but it is a risky thing. You are writing about depravity, about danger, about abuse, about torment, about people being vulnerable, people being at risk, people being hurt and killed and hunted and kidnapped and assaulted. These are horrible things to write. It takes bravery to write horror. And then we come to the fact that it also has to be scary. And horror won't be scary for everyone. It'll be particularly scary for some groups who relate to the content and the events within certain books, and maybe not so much for others who might not be able to empathize with what is on display. It takes so much bravery to write horror because you're writing horrible people doing horrible things, or you're writing vulnerable people being succumbed to horrible things. There's so much risk involved in doing that. And Eric does it so well. Eric LaRocca is a queer writer, and many of his stories are queer. His protagonists are often gay men and lesbians, often couples, and homophobia features pretty strongly in a lot of his stories, which in itself is a risky thing. Talking about the abuse that people suffer at the hands of homophobia on a systemic societal level and on a more personal, physical, emotionally abusive level, that's a risky thing to do. But it's also necessary to keep horror relevant. Because horror can be two different things. It can be generally, broadly scary when we're talking about vampires and monsters and eldritch horror. These things can all be scary for everyone. Cults are scary. Monsters are scary. Things that go bump in the night are scary. Slasher killers are scary. But horror can also be thematically dense, it can be topical, it can be allegorical. And Eric LaRocca does all of those things, usually within the realms of queerness, because he is a queer writer, and I would assume a lot of his audience might be queer as well. I certainly am. And I also know that horror speaks to the queer community. A lot of queer people, especially trans people, seem to really love horror. Or maybe I'm just projecting. But Eric is boldly and bravely weaving homophobia and the topical fears and trepidations of the queer community into his stories, and that takes guts as well. Then there's the simple fact that Eric is willing to talk about and express very boldly, frighteningly, grotesquely vivid things, and I think that this collection is the best example of that. The Trees Grew Because I Bled There is absolutely horrible. There are stories in here that will really make you squirm, that will make your skin crawl, make your hair stand on end. All of those cliched things that we say that horror does, every story in here will do that. Some of them are queer, some of them are not, or at least not explicitly, but they are all relatable, they are all frightening and shocking, and there is a real emphasis on body horror in this collection. Burning things, abuse and torture, bodies doing impossibly strange things. This is grotesque. This is bloody, terrifying, twisted, nasty body horror. I love body horror. Reanimator is one of my favourite films. I'm a massive fan of the films of David Cronenberg and John Carpenter. I love body horror. And this is a collection that doesn't just pay homage to the body horror subgenre, but also does brave, strange new things with it. A great example is a story in here about a young woman who loves burning things and burning people, and her sister puts her in charge of her niece for a little while. She's got this little infant niece, and she's terrified that she's gonna try and burn her niece. Like, burn her alive. She's like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna be tempted to do it. I love burning things. And, I mean, just read it. There is depravity in horror, and there is a guilt that comes with writing and enjoying it. And it takes guts, as I keep saying, to write and enjoy horror sometimes. People kind of judge you for it. And so Eric leans into that. And I guess as a queer person, there's always a sense that you've got nothing left to lose. People are going to hate you no matter what. So be depraved in your horror. And also, sometimes it feels like that's the only way to truly shock and frighten people, is to be shocking, is to be frightening. I think about the films Terrifier 1 and 2. Really shocking, depraved, frightening films. And there are stories in here that made me feel as on edge and almost nauseous as those two films. Then you've got the way that he structures his stories. I'm a huge fan of epistolary fiction, and that's why I loved Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, but that's also why I loved this. You've Lost a Lot of Blood. I don't know if it was a good idea or not, but I looked at the Goodreads reviews of this before I read it, and that was because this book doesn't have a blurb, and I wanted to get an idea of what it actually is. Whether it's a short story collection or a novella, I wanted to understand it a bit more, so I went on Goodreads, and I saw a lot of 1 and 2 star reviews from people just saying that it's not anything, that it makes no sense, that it's confusing, that it is just gibberish, and I have no idea how any of those people came to that conclusion. It really annoyed me. All I could think was that they were stupid and not paying attention. This book opens with an editor's note, and that note says that what you're about to read is a collection of writings from a serial killer, this guy with the strange name of Martyr Black. Martyr Black and his partner killed a bunch of people, and the editor's note explains that you're going to read diary entries, poems, transcripts, and even a novella, all written by this guy. He kept diaries, he wrote out transcripts from recordings, he wrote his own poetry, and he even managed to get a novella written with some small indie press, and it's all contained in here. So you read that note, then you read a diary entry from this guy, then you read one of his poems, then you read a transcript, then you read the first few chapters of his novella, and then it cycles back. And you do that again and again and again. And the novella obviously takes up the most space in here, a book within a book. And it's a really good novella. It's really terrifying. And again, it's got some twisted body horror. It's very gothic, very claustrophobic, very intense, about a young woman who has been hired/recruited to to work on a video game with this strange enigmatic man. She arrives at his house, which is an enormous mansion, and she's kind of trapped there, and she's brought her little brother with her because their parents recently died and she's responsible for him. And the place is strange, and her boss has been in an accident and is bound up in bandages, so his sister takes control of the house and all of the work, and our protagonist has no idea what's going on. But all of this was a novella within this book written by a serial killer, and we're also reading his thoughts, his experiences, and his bad poetry. This is incredible. We Can Never Leave This Place is frightening. I don't want to say too much about it, but this is a 100-page novella that bummed me out. It is a really twisted, gnarly, and strange thing, set in an odd dystopian world where a family is trapped in a flat in a war-torn city, and the flat slowly gets invaded by circus people who are all anthropomorphized monstrous animals. A giant spider person, a giant snake person, and a giant cockroach person. And they all start living in this flat and tormenting this 15-year-old girl whose mother has welcomed them in and says to the girl, "Stop being mean to our guests. They're all fine. You're being weird. But these people are spiders and cockroaches." It's fucking weird, and it actually made me kind of sad. It's a very oppressive, dark, twisted, claustrophobic thing. I mentioned explosions and then didn't follow through with that at all, so I'm just going to mention here, this is Eric LaRocca's full-length novel, Everything the Darkness Eats, which I have just reviewed. It's incredible, and it starts with a man in Wales popping the heads of a bunch of people. He uses some strange eldritch magic to explode people's heads into confetti of blood and brain bits. So there's your explosions. If you want to know more about this, watch my review. I could talk about the works of Eric LaRocca forever. I love his mind. I love the way he structures his stories. Everything he writes is truly unique. He explores different subgenres of horror in experimental and strange ways. No one writes like him. As I said, it's important to be topical when it comes to horror, thematically, allegorically, and LaRocca is doing that specifically with queer narratives and stories, and he does that so well, while also pushing horror and making sure that it's as frightening, terrifying, shocking, bloody, gory, and nasty as it possibly can be, to make sure you really are terrified. He does that so well, and that's why he's my favourite horror writer by a long shot. Check out all of his works and subscribe for books.